That was very kind. Thank you. I'll try to be brief and leave a lot of times for question and answer. I know since you are associated with the University of Chicago, you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. Try to get out of the way of that. I was truly formed by the University of Chicago. I was not a good student in high school. I knew at age 7 I wanted to write. I read a book called Paddington the Bear. Does anybody read Paddington the Bear anymore? And so I decided I wanted to do that. And then I went to high school and I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But so those were my values. She obviously had different ones. And then the admissions offices at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I would go to the U of C. I was not a good student, but when I was at Chicago, this is literally true, they accepted 70% of the applicants. It was self-selective, so it was a very high rate, but you did not have to have great grades, and I succeeded. And then I was really formed by the first 2 years. The first 2 years, the great book, The Common Core, was really one of the central formations of my life, reading Hobbes and Locke. And back in those days, there was a guy named, there were still some German refugees who were teaching Western Civ and the great books. And they really believed that the books we were teaching had the keys to the kingdom, that had truth, ultimate truth. And they taught them with a passion and a fervor, which was sort of religious. And it's not so much that I remember the books, though some of those books have become the major books of my life. It's just the fervor with which they approached ideas left a permanent mark. And a lot of what I do is still going back to those same books, Hobbes, Locke, Burke, and really changed by them. And one of the things I've learned about college especially is the older you get, the more you realize how formed you are by it. That the first book that I was assigned freshman year was called Reflections on Revolution in France by Edmund Burke, and I loathed it. And I wrote about 6 papers about what a disgraceful human being this guy Burke was. And then it's now the central book of my life. He's got a phrase called epistemological modesty, and how complicated the world is and how cautious we should be on how much we can understand it. And that's really the lodestar which all my political writing and even my personal life is sort of based around. And so I went to Chicago. My favorite thing about the school was it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And in those days, we were completely unprepared for the world after college. The school did absolutely nothing to help us get a job or anything. So I enjoyed an exciting year after graduation as a bartender at the Quad Club. It was actually in some ways one of the best years I ever had. I had a faculty member drinking in front of me. One guy used to have 4 double vodka martinis before dinner every night, which we calculated as 3,200 calories of booze, and then he would go to dinner with a bottle. A couple of them would line their lithium antidepressant tablets up at the bar and chug them down. They were very entertaining, but complete basket cases. And so then I was given a good piece of advice, which is to say yes to everything. And so somebody offered me a job as, well, I'll tell you the one story, and this is a feature of getting a job. There's always some ridiculously lucky break that's uncategorizable. And so I was a student at Chicago. I was writing for Maroon. I wrote a humor column. And William F. Buckley was a very prominent columnist at the time, came to campus. And I wrote a column making fun of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. And, I said Buckley wrote the first 3 volumes of his memoirs on the day of his birth, like all of human history up to his conception, then the Seeds of Utopia about his gestation, and the Glorious Dawn about his birth. And I said, he turns water into wine. He founded 2 magazines at Yale, one called the National Buckley, one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And so it was just attacking him. And he came to campus and he gave a talk. And he said, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And so that was my break. Sadly, I wasn't in the audience. But 3 years later, I called him and said, is the offer still open? And he said, yeah. And I was in Chicago covering rapes. And 24 hours later, I was at his Park Avenue pied-à-terre in New York. And so it was just one of those random things that happened. And after that, I just said yes to everything. I was a movie critic. I was a book review editor. I was a foreign correspondent. And life followed me in ways that I could not have predicted. And basically, I spent my 20s just trying on different costumes and seeing what fit. And I highly urge you to, 2 things I'll say. The first, in my view, the first thing out of college, the first year, and I think this applies to graduate school too, is in the first year, your jobs are likely going to suck. You do a lot of menial work. If you're in school, there are highly educated people who are paid to read your writing and pay attention to your brilliant words. That will never happen again. There's sort of a Kanye phrase that comes to mind, there's a million of you, there's only one of me. Your bosses will all have that mentality. And so your job, the first year out, your only job is to widen your horizon of risk. If you do something completely unusual that first year out, you'll go through life with a horizon of risk out here thinking I can do anything. If you do something conventional, your horizon of risk all through life will be here. So I have a friend, she graduated from UVA. She applied for Teach for America, and she didn't get in. So she Googled Teach Abroad. And some guy from Korea said, we need an English teacher. And so she told her parents there was this big elaborate program that would take care of her, but it was just a guy from Korea. And then she went out, she flew out, she lands at Seoul and then goes to a little fishing village, lands at the airport. She lands at about 10 p.m. There's nobody there to greet her. So she's sitting on a bench in Korea and there's nobody there. She doesn't speak Korean, she has no money, she doesn't know what to do. There's a monk sitting at the bench next to her, and he's the only guy left beside her at the airport, and he leaves. Then they shut down all the lights, and she's sitting there at 2 in the morning, and finally a white van pulls up with the 5 Korean guys, and they say, are you Blair? Get in the van, you're our teacher. And so, of course, she gets in the van and spent the next 19 months there teaching English. But after that, that sort of widened your horizon of risk. If I can do that, I can do anything. And so that's the one thing I'll say. And then the central thing I'll say, just for a few more minutes, is, in my view, and this took me a long time in life to realize, it's always important to look at these decisions through a moral lens. You can look at through the flat lens of the career or the moral lens of vocation. And you will feel starved and emotionally dissatisfied if you don't start right away thinking of it through the moral lens. And so what's a vocation more than a career? One, it's a sense of being called to something. One of the heroes in my last book was this woman named Frances Perkins. And she was a social worker, sort of a good person, but sort of unfocused in her 20s. And she was sitting in Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan having tea, and she heard a commotion, and she rushed down the street, and she sees a fire. It's 1913. And she sees what's one of the most famous fires in American history, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She looks up and she sees what she thinks are bundles of clothing being thrown out of the 10th floor window of this factory, but it's like 9/11, people are choosing to leap to their deaths rather than burn to death. They're trapped in this factory. And she sees about 57 people go off the side. And there's a guy who's helping the seamstresses over the windowsill and dropping them into space. She sees him do 1, 2, 3, and then his fourth was his girlfriend who he kisses and then drops into space, and then he goes over the side. And so that was a searing moment for her. What in the words of Mother Teresa, her call within a call. So we all have certain careers that we're embarked in, but in the course of that career, sometimes an event happens to you that purifies your motivation. And so she was sort of a do-gooder, but after that fire, she just was ruthless. She would work with anybody, compromise, do anything to advance the cause of worker safety. And she spent the next 50 years as an agent for worker rights and rose up the state government in New York and then became Secretary of Labor under FDR, the first woman in the cabinet. And it was 50 years of complete ruthless dedication to that thing. And it was a sense of, we tell people, discover your passion. But people have done studies of this. 80% of students don't have a passion. And we tell people to look within. But in my view, if you look within for your vocation, for your purpose in life, the answer is not there. There's a guy named Viktor Frankl who was a psychologist in Austria in the 1930s. He was thrown into Auschwitz. And he said, this wasn't what I planned for my life, but this is what life planned for me. And the first thing I've learned, it's not what do I want from life, it's what is life asking of me? What is my circumstance asking me to do? And his circumstance put him in a concentration camp, and he decided his job was to study suffering. And so he became a student of suffering. He said suffering was a problem upon which I did not want to turn my back. And then he decided to figure out, why are some people surviving? And the people who were surviving were the people who were deeply in love with something outside the camp. And they thought of that thing they loved outside the camp. And so there was one guy who said, if I don't make it out of here, and you do, go to my wife, tell her I thought of her every second, every day I was here. Tell her that our brief marriage made all of this worth it, even what we've suffered in here. And so he thought of her every day. And that was the sort of thing that kept you alive. And so Perkins was a person who didn't find her passion inside, but that fire was a circumstance that demanded her response. And it was a mixture of her talent with that outward circumstance. And as Fred Buechner, a novelist, said, your vocation is where your deep gladness meets the world's deepest need. And so that's the first lesson from Perkins is, don't look inside, look outside. Now, having said that, I gave this advice to a bit of students at Sewanee, and I got an email from a young grad a couple weeks later. She said, I quit my job in Washington. I'm walking around the streets looking for my problem. I was like, don't take me that literally. So that's one thing about a vocation, a sense of calling. The third thing is a sense of mission, a sense of transcendent purpose. And so it took me a long time to figure out what my mission was. And there are two ways I see my mission. I have a series of things I'd like to achieve in life. One is I'm the last Whig. I have a version of moderate republicanism that Abraham Lincoln started with, and Teddy Roosevelt and Alexander Hamilton. And I like to promote that style of politics. I think that's a mission. There are only 6 of us, and it's hopeless, but I'm going to do that. The second thing is I was born reasonably shallow, and I'm trying to get more profound. I'm trying to live in a more grace-filled manner. And so I explore that through my writing. And I try to shift the conversation from an over-politicized conversation we have now to a more moral conversation. Because I think we're a society, we're over-politicized and under-moralized. And my students at Yale have lack of moral vocabulary. They're really good people. They just don't know how to think about it. None of the words. Sin, grace, redemption. And so I try to think about what those words are. And so these are just transcendent missions. The third thing is, when I think about what my mission is to be, it's not what do I want to do, a lot of it is who I want to be. That the job we pick creates who we are. It's identity formation. And so a lot of what I do is I look at people and I think, who have they become through their work and through their service? And some people just radiate an inner light. We were talking about Frederick, Maryland, and you serve on this board. I was up there, I don't know, a year and a half ago, and I ran to the group where you serve, and there were these ladies, mostly ladies, I think, and maybe mostly age 50 to 70. And one of the things they do is they teach immigrants how to read English. And this is a long, slow process. And when I walk into this room, they just radiated patience and goodness. And they didn't know me from Adam, most of them, and they treated me like truly with honoring welcoming. And when I meet people like that, I think, I've achieved way more career success than I ever thought possible. But that inner light that they were radiating, that sense of goodness, I haven't achieved that. How do you get that? And so I've really spent a lot of time thinking about how do you get that. And I think there are two things. One is working on your own shit, basically. Each of us has a core sin, some core thing that tends to plague us. For some people, it's fear. And for those people, you got to ask yourself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? And there's this weird moment of growth when your fear is like a guide. Where does your longing meet the resistance of fear? And so you head to your fears. And then one of the things is just that, one of the things they do is they've headed toward their fears. The second thing, that some people suffer from vanity, from greed, and they work on it, and they become strong in their most broken place. So in the book, I tell the story about Dwight Eisenhower, who when he was 9, he wanted to go trick-or-treating, and his mom wouldn't let him. And so he threw a temper tantrum, punched the tree in his front yard so bad that he rubbed all the skin off his fingers. His mom sent him up to his room, had him cry for an hour, and she came up to bind his wounds and recited a verse from Proverbs, which was, he who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 60 years later, when Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, he said that was the most important conversation of his life, because it taught him that he had a problem, which was his anger, a temper, a nasty temperament. And if he was going to be worth anything and do anything in life, he had to conquer that. And every day, we think of him as this garrulous country club kind of guy, but every day he worked on his temper. And he tried to make himself optimistic and upbeat. He worked on his tendency to hate people. And he had all these little tricks, like when he would think about the people I hate, and he would write their name on a piece of paper, and then he'd rip it up and throw it in the garbage can as a way to purge his hatred. But he and a lot of the people you meet realize that the central drama of their life is not the external climb up to success, it's the internal conflict against their own sin. And they work hard on that internal drama. On the days when they have helped themselves and they're behaved internally in a good way, they're elated. And the days when they don't, they're humiliated. But it's that internal drama. How internally am I doing? And that was one thing I think they've done. But the big thing I think they've done is they're capable of making these awesome commitments to things outside themselves. And so another character in my book was a woman named Dorothy Day. And Dorothy Day was a young woman in Chicago, among other places, who, when she read novels, she couldn't just read them. She acted that she lived like the character she was reading. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she was drinking a lot, partying, carousing a lot, 2 suicide attempts, 2 abortions, living a life she was ashamed of. But then she was transformed by the birth of her child. When she was in her late 20s, she had a child out of wedlock. And it occurred to her that that all the accounts of childbirth she had ever read were written by guys. So she decided she'd write one. She sat down 40 minutes after the birth of her child and wrote one. And most of it is about the violence of the pain. But it ends with this sentence: if I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, painted the most beautiful painting, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my child. And with this came a need to worship and to adore. And she needed somebody to thank for this joy. So she became a Catholic. She started a Catholic Worker, a newspaper. She started soup kitchens. She started homeless shelters. And she spent the next 50 years of her life not only serving the poor, but living a life of poverty with the poor. And that was just a long, awesome commitment. A commitment to 50 years. And to me, a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. And to me, to lead a successful life, you build 4 big commitments. There are 4 big commitments that we all tend to go through. 1 to a spouse and a family, 1 to a vocation, to your career, 1 to a philosophy or faith, a commitment to a set of ideas, and then finally to a community, to the people you're going to serve. And the quality of your life is defined by how well you do at choosing those commitments and then living them out over a long period of time. And to me, commitment making is hard because the commitments you make will change who you are. And it's hard to make that leap into a marriage or into a job or into a career when you don't know what you're going to feel like in 30 years. And so how do you make that? And I've basically come to conclude you can't think your way through it. You have to love your way through it. You have to fall in love with something. So it becomes irresistible to you. The philosophers have a thing called the vampire problems. And suppose somebody came up to you and said, would you like to become a vampire? In one sense, it would be cool. You could live forever. You could fly around at night. You'd have all these special talents. You could drink blood. It wouldn't have to be human blood. It could be like cow blood that's donated. And so the problem is, you as a human don't know what it feels like to be a vampire, because the act of becoming a vampire will change who you are. And so it's really hard as a human self to project onto your vampire self. And so any big commitment is a vampire problem. Before you get married, you don't know what you're going to be like as a married person. Marriage will change you. Choosing a job, going to the Marine Corps, all these things will change you. I guarantee you having kids will change you. And so you're projecting onto your other self. And so the only way you can do it is be deeply in love with something and to have the capacity for deep love. And then to have a feeling that love is morally vindicated. That it's not, a commitment is not just to love with something, but it satisfies your sense of meaning, your longing for meaning. And then it's also disciplined. It's disciplined by the craft you do. So my job, I'm a writer, and so, writing could be this fluffy activity, but I have to produce a column every 2 days, or every 3 days. For those of you in college, imagine having a paper due in 3 days, and then imagine that's the rest of your life. That's me. And so there's a discipline to it. And the way I write is I have a very bad memory, so I write everything down, and for each column I gather about 200 pages of notes. And the writing process is not typing on the keyboard, it's taking all my papers and arranging them on piles in my living room. Each pile is a paragraph in my column. And my column may only be 806 words, but I'll have 14 piles for all the little short paragraphs. And so the writing process is me crawling around on the floor, putting the papers into piles, or maybe reorganizing the piles, getting the structure right. And I tell my students, before you sit down and type, your paper should be 80% done, because it's all about structure and organizing the piles. And there are some moments, even like this morning, where I'm crawling around organizing my piles, and thoughts are coming to me, and I'm writing down and putting them on Post-it notes in the right piles. And that's like the best moment of my job. And it's almost like a form of prayer. And so the discipline of the craft does it. And then the discipline of honesty, of facing yourself accurately. And then the discipline of community, having people around you who uphold certain standards and insist that you uphold certain standards. People in your team or whatever. And so these are all ways of seeing commitments, like to a vocation, to a philosophy of faith, to a family, and to a community, as anchors. And the final thought I'll leave you with, and then we can talk about whatever, is that we have this autonomy culture, that you want to keep your options open. I'm sure you have FOMO as much as my Yale students. And a lot of people choose careers that'll keep their options open, especially in consulting businesses. And we have a culture of autonomy. We have a culture of the internet. It's hard to make a long commitment when you can't control your attention span for more than 30 seconds. But the deepest freedom is not freedom from things, it's freedom to. And it's the things you bind yourself to that set you free, that give you strength. And so closing off options is like the job of people from 20 to 35. And when you've closed off enough options, then you're really liberated to be really good on the few yeses you've embraced. And so it's really important over the next few years just to say no, and then bind yourself down. That's my opening rant. Thank you. Any questions on Thomas Hobbes or whatever? Or life in Washington, where to live, restaurants, I know that too. Donald Trump. Yeah. Chicago audience, already a contradiction. Well, to me, that's a question of chronology. So the first year or two out, try on everything. To me, like even what I believed, it took me like 5 jobs to figure out what I believed. Or even, because a different, like I worked at the National Review, which is a very social conservative organization. I tried that on for a couple of years. It didn't quite fit. I went to the Wall Street Journal. It was very libertarian. That didn't quite fit. And it wasn't only until I worked at this magazine called The Weekly Standard, where I had no supervisor, where I could really figure out what I believed. And suddenly I found things, which is sort of this Whig, moderate Republican philosophy, that I found out what I fit. So it was that process of trying things on and then saying no. So I would like say marriage. So I'm not sure this is our subject here, but I guarantee you the most important decision you'll make in your life is who to marry. And if you have a great career and a crappy marriage, you will be unhappy. If you have a great marriage and a crappy career, you'll be happy. And so how do you make that decision? At 18, I would not advise it, because you have not become who you are yet. And so at 22, I would advise like trying things on. By 30, I think it's time to think about closing in on that person. But but so that it's a matter of chronology. But so in the beginning, I would, try on everything, experiment with everything, live anywhere. And your parents will go quietly insane while you go through this process. But I think there's a wisdom to that pattern of rhythm. Yeah, it's sort of on commitment making. So this is much on my mind, and what I do is I teach my classes, and so I have a seminar up at Yale where I'm beginning to think about that, where we did a couple weeks on marriage, a couple weeks on how to form a philosophy, and now we're doing a couple weeks on vocation. And I will say one thing I've learned, especially from my students this year, is they have a difficult time being vulnerable because they're checking each other out all the time. And what's interesting is they have a difficult time with friendship because they're just so damn busy. And so one of my students said to me, my life is about putting out fires. Paper due, that's a fire. I got to take care of that. LSAT, that's a fire. My girlfriend is sometimes a fire. My friends are never on fire. That's an essence of friendships. They're just steady for you. And if you don't call them for a couple weeks, they're fine. And so as a result, the friendships go into the background. And I don't know, my students only really discover the importance of friendships like the last 4 months of senior year. Because then they realize I'm leaving these people. And I will say I hire, I've had a whole series of assistants who are usually 2 or 3 years out of college. So I really look at people in their 20s a lot. And they go through hardship. Like all of life up to graduation from university is structured in a certain way. And then suddenly you're thrown out into this vast unstructured space. And there are no automatic ways to make friends. There's lots of unemployment. My assistants and their friends have had these miserable bosses. They all had some experience with that. And every person I've hired, certainly the last 6, they have some complete romantic cataclysm like 6 months after I hire them. I've come to recognize, I don't know what it is about me or them, but like some major breakup. And now I've learned, just go home for a week, come back, you'll be better. But that happens. And the people you're going to count on during all those dark periods is your friends. And so the experience of cultivating friendship is just so super important. For my readers or on TV, I don't know who they are. They're just somewhere out there. And I'm not oblivious to them. We have a thing on, which is very pernicious, called the most emailed and the most viewed list on the New York Times homepage. And I should not care. I should just do the best column I can. But if I go 3 columns and I don't hit number 1 on most viewed or most emailed, I'll write one that I know will get up there. And so there's certain subjects, like right now, if you bash Donald Trump, you're going right up there. But, if you write, Barack Obama is great, my husband sucks, you'll get there. The most number 1 emailed story in the history of the New York Times was written by a woman who was a killer whale trainer at like SeaWorld or something like that. And she used her techniques that she had learned in training killer whales to train her husband. And she wrote about what that was like. And so the big technique is when an animal misbehaves, you don't scold it, you just ignore the misbehavior. And so whenever her husband misbehaved, she just ignored him. And so he learned to recognize the signs, and he hungered to do well because he hated being ignored. So anyway, that's apropos of nothing. But so they're just out there, and I don't know them. And the reason I teach at Yale is because in my regular work, I have no community, and I don't have any real contact with my audience. So I teach so I can see the same names, at least the same people, 14 weeks in a row, and I can learn their names, which is what I don't get. And so creating a community of people who actually I know and I care about has become, it's very hard in my job. Being a writer is isolated as it is, and being a columnist is super isolated. I have no boss. I've been there 13 years. I've never had a performance review. I've never sat in on a meeting. I just put 2 columns in the paper a week, and that's all I do. And so it's super isolating. And I sort of long for the days back when I was part of a team at a magazine. And so I'm just a blogger out there. I have like unlimited travel budget. I can go anywhere in the world. So I can have total freedom, but total isolation. And so creating for me a community of warm places has been super important, just as a matter of survival. And that's going to be true. What I do is not unusual anymore. 30% of workers are not conventional office workers. They're a consultant here, they're doing this there, they got 9 different things. And so they have to structure their own lives. And so I have now learned to build places like going to college. My office hours at Yale are in a bar between 9:30 and 1. And so that's like a good time for me. The students come in, we have a few drinks, and that's like a warm place. And so you just created a series of those because I don't have a real office. This was like the core subject of my last book. I'm glad you asked. The book is based on the assumption or the argument that in each of us we have 2 sets of virtues, the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are things that make you good at your job. Are you a good teacher? Are you a good social worker? Are you a good journalist? Whatever. And the eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead. Are you honest? Are you caring? Are you capable of great love? Are you brave? And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important. We'd all rather be known for who we are. But we live in a culture, in an educational system that prioritizes or is more articulate about the resume virtues. A lot of us are more clear about how to have a great career than how to be a really good person. And if you are all resume and not eulogy, your life will fall apart at some point. You'll just feel deeply unsatisfied. And so part of my, I achieved, as I mentioned, like every career dream I had. When I was at Chicago, I wanted to be a writer. I remember thinking, if I got a job at an airline magazine, I'd be fine. And I've far surpassed that. But at a certain stage of my life, was my happiness level up? No. Because I didn't have that internal joy. And so that you have to work on. And the tricky part of the two, you got to have a balance between the two. And the tricky part is that they operate by different logics. So the resume part is economics, is what you bring to the marketplace. And the logic of self-improvement is straightforward. Practice makes perfect, effort leads to reward, input leads to output. But to develop the inner part, it's not an economic logic, it's a moral logic, which is filled with paradoxes. Like, you've got to give to receive, you devote yourself to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. Success can lead to the greatest failure, which is arrogance and pride. Failure can lead to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. To find yourself, you have to lose yourself. And so it's a set of inversions. And the way the inner life is built is not through conquering it, but through surrender and through, dying to self, as they say in the churches. And so getting these two logics right takes a balance. I read this great essay by Leo Tolstoy. And Leo Tolstoy had written War and Peace, he'd written Anna Karenina, and he got to be Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers of all time. And he came to a place where he wanted to commit suicide because he just was unfulfilled. And he realized that if I want to be fulfilled, I've got to go down to go up. I got to simplify my life. I got to find a spiritual life. I've got to more live like the peasants. I've got to work with my hands. I've got to have a hobby. And so he got to be the greatest writer, maybe in his country's history, and it still was unsatisfying. And if that's going to happen to Leo Tolstoy, it's probably going to happen to the rest of us. Action in the social justice, in a wider sense. I'd say 2 things. One, souls are not saved in bundles. They're saved one by one. And so a lot of what's important in our lives is beneath the level of politics. Samuel Johnson had a couplet, which I'm about to butcher. Of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure. And so you think about your life, what really matters, it's mostly the quality of the relationships you have with the people around you. And politics can do a lot of things, but it's not going to be priority of that. And so just taking time off to separate the public sphere and look at the internal life and the quality of your loves is the first thing that I think is important. Nonetheless, I do think that politics matters a lot. I spent a lot of time embracing it, and I believe government matters a lot. I read somewhere there are 13,000 NGOs in Haiti. But unless they get the basic law and order right and the basic governance right, there's going to be a limit to how much those NGOs can accomplish. And so serving in government is super important. And I will say my friends here in town who have worked in government, after they leave, they talk about those government years with intensity. It's always the most intense period of their life. I knew a guy named Richard Darman who was the budget director for the first President Bush, HW. And I had dinner with him a few weeks, actually, before he died. And he was CEO of 2 companies. And he was really busy. These were big companies. One, I think, was the Carlyle Group, maybe. And he said, I want you to know that no day that I have now with my companies is as important and vital as every day was in government. There was an intensity and a size to the decision-making that he felt that he never felt ever again. Another friend of mine, she's in government right now, and she says, every day sucks, but the overall job is awesome. So like individual frustrations, but the overall sense of reward is awesome. And so I do think government can make a big difference. And to me, the big thing government can do is thicken society. I do think we have a problem in this society. We're just atomized. Partly it's levels of social distrust. It used to be most people trusted each other. Said if you asked them in a survey, do you trust most of the people around you? Pretty significant majorities would say yes. Now it's like 23% say yes, I trust people around me. And the group that's the most distrustful is millennials. And I said that to one of my students, and she said, well, have you seen our dating lives? You'd know why we're distrusting of each other. But so there's just this fragmentation. 24% of households, people live alone. There are more households with dogs than with children. There's just great sense of solitude in society. And people who grow up, in a sense, in a disorganized neighborhood with a lot of solitude, without thick fabric of bonds, they just have diminished life chances. And so to me, anything we can do to nurture loving relationships. And I will say, if you come to this city, it is the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And if you mention the word love at a congressional hearing, they look at you like you're Oprah, like, what are you talking about? But most of good social policy is creating the context in which people can create loving bonds, whether it's educational policy, whether it's poverty policy, or even within a company. So that's my vast overview on that subject. Yeah, so some people write directly about themselves as a way, Elizabeth Gilbert, anybody read Eat, Pray, Love? So like, I'm the only man who's ever finished that book. But so she writes about herself. I'm the sort of person who processes his own stuff by writing about other people. And so like I'll write about, I wrote a column about middle age a couple of days ago. I'm middle-aged. I'm like, I write about other people, but I'm really working out my own stuff. And so a lot of it is subterfuge. And a lot of my columns are just love letters to my girlfriend. Only she knows the way they are, but they're dovetailed toward her. And so you're like working out your personal stuff, because to write authentically, it has to touch your deepest passion. But I'm writing for a newspaper, and so you want to do it through subterfuge. I will say the tension I got was, in the beginning I was doing political columns, but I really came to the conclusion, as I said, that we're under-moralized. We don't talk about moral categories or all the stuff I've been talking about enough. So I began to shift the column over in that direction. And I could feel people around the paper like, what is he doing? Is he going wahoo? But then the page views were so high. And one of the things I found is that with this last book, which is all about love and sacrifice and how to turn moments of suffering into moments of growth, it's super emotional. And I found there's just this hunger for it. And my last book sold, 60% more than any other previous book. It's not because the book is so much better, it's because the hunger for meaning is so high. And I would go into, when I was on book tour, I'd go into the big convention rooms like this times 100, and there'd be a bunch of business executives. And if you're at the CEO level, it's basically a bunch of white guys age 64. And they're talking all day about fiduciary responsibilities, healthcare costs, the financial quarterly reports. It's dry business stuff. And I'm going in there with my talk about suffering and love and grace. And I'm thinking, this is not going to go well because they're not here. And as soon as I would start telling stories from that talk, they would lock in. Because it's just, we're in a culture where nobody's as much talking about this, and there's a hunger for it. So it felt like, being a sprinkler system in the desert. And the only one exception was I gave a talk about virtue to a bunch of hedge fund guys. And the guy said, you're making me feel guilty. I'm fine. I make a lot of money. I've had a good life. I don't want to think about this crap. And so, but that was the one exception. Generally, people are thirsty. And so, as I've gone off in this other sphere, there's been great receptivity. As I say, one of the things that is necessary as you go through this process is how do you navigate? And so the one thing I would do, a couple things, and this is going to sound wahoo, but I think it makes sense. We're really weirdly motivated by beauty. And so when mathematicians talk about the beauty of a mathematical form, and writers talk about the beauty of good sentences, and I don't know, for people who are involved in social work and other things, the beauty of a good community. And so if you just follow your nose for beauty, that's one thing. And Plato, to get very UChicago on us, has a passage in the Symposium where he says young people should be surrounded by beauty. First, they'll notice the beauty of a physical form, a person or whatever, and then that will remind them of the beauty of an idea, which is a higher beauty. And then that will remind them of the beauty of justice, which is a well-governed community. And that will remind them of an ultimate beauty which transcends all beauties, from which nothing can be taken away or added, which it's Neoplatonism version of God, really. And so if you follow your sense of beauty, that's one guiding post as you go through. The second, I do think fear is a good orienter. I once had a friend, he was being interviewed for a job, and in the end he asked the interviewer a question, and he said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she would get out of that job. And I've asked my students that, and I had a young woman say to me, I'd quit Yale, I'd quit. And so that's a good question. And then the final thing to be said is your talents. What talents are you natively born into? And then how can what talents do you enjoy? And when you figure out what your talents are, it's another way of asking yourself the question, not what makes me happy, but what pains am I willing to endure? So if you're joining the Marine Corps, say, you're going to endure a lot of pain. But if you're willing to endure a sort of pain, then you must really value it. And then I'll end with three other things. A friend of mine, an acquaintance really, is a guy named Fred Swaniker. And he wrote an article recently on at Medium, which is this big website. And he said, when I ask myself certain questions, what I want to do with my life, I ask myself three questions. The first is it big enough? That if you're fortunate enough to go to a school like Chicago, or Fred, I think, went to Brown, then you're in a good position in life. You've been blessed. So you should be tackling the world's biggest problems. The second thing, he said, are you uniquely positioned in your life to tackle this problem? And so Fred, for example, he's from Ghana, and he started this high school for superstar African students in South Africa. And then he started something called the African Leadership Academy, which is sort of a Davos of young African business leaders. And then he looked at the higher ed in Africa and said, we do not have great universities on this continent. And so he said, well, I've already started a high school. I've got a leadership academy. I'm actually uniquely positioned to start a university. And so Fred has already started 3 universities, and he's going to start 20 more. And within a few years, he'll have 20,000 students every year rotating through. And so that's A, a very big problem he's addressing. B, he was uniquely situated. And 3, his third question is, do you care so much that you're willing to stay up nights? You can't sleep because you're thinking about this thing. And so these are all like good guideposts as you go through the process of trying stuff out. It's a question of just formulations, I think. Okay, I'm going to read you a quote, if I can find it. The first thing that comes to mind is Dorothy Day, who I mentioned, had a phrase, stay small, because she lived, as I said, in the soup kitchens. She became very famous by the end of her life. And they wanted her to become a supervisor. And she said, no, I need to be in the serving meals every day. So no matter how prominent she got, she needed the direct contact with the people she was serving. And that was part because for religious sense, she needed the sense of purity. She wanted to seek to be pure. And she was Catholic, and one of the things she would say is, you're not actually serving the poor for the poor. Because sometimes you'll serve them and they'll be unpleasant. And they won't give you the psychic rewards you expect. And so she was a Christian. She said, I'm not serving the poor for the poor. I'm serving God. And God always wants the same thing, that service. And so that was, on the other hand, Frances Perkins, the woman who's Secretary of Labor, she went big. She went up the political ladder. And she did not enjoy the benefits of purity that Dorothy Day had and direct service, but she endured and got to enjoy the fulfillment of having greater impact. And when she was in the realm of politics, so she did not have purity at all. She was compromising and doing all the stuff that politics involves. And these are like two different models of how to serve. And so one is very empathetic, one is a little less so. And I find this true in many careers. There's a moment where you're on the front lines, and then you get a chance to be promoted to a position of responsibility, like from teacher to principal, or from writer to editor. And you lose contact with the people you're dealing, but you have greater responsibility. And most people, they go up to that second level, even though it's less fun, because they want a greater impact. I myself went up there, I didn't like it, I went back down to writing. And so, but that moment of promotion is a tricky moment. So there are just those two models. The second thing I'll say is I think it's important to talk about love a lot. I do think we're primarily loving creatures, not cognitive, intellectual creatures. And so you just got to think about what love is and order your loves. And so one of the things, we often get our loves out of order. This is St. Augustine made this point. Suppose you, a friend tells you a story in confidence and then you blab it at a dinner party. You're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship. And that's called sin, when we get that loves out of order, which we have a tendency to do. And the second thing to do is just to be vulnerable to love. That's why I think a liberal arts education is important, because it educates your emotions. And then the third, love humbles you. Love eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. When you're in love with a friend, you get more pleasure out of giving a gift to that person than receiving it, because you're giving to a piece of yourself. And then the final thing love does, and empathy does, is it fuses you with another person. And the quote I'm going to read is, I like reading this quote, it's from Captain Corelli's Mandolin, if anybody read this novel, Louis de Bernier. And he's got a scene early where there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship with his wife, who's now dead. And the old guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. It's that beautiful fusing of people. And that hopefully happens within a marriage, but it can also happen with people you're serving. And I find, and this is true of my students, it's certainly true at Washington, we go through life with a prosaic hedging our bets attitude. And we probably do it for our own safety, but it means that everything we're sort of committed to that person, but we're hedging. And then there's some people who just pour out love on the job or where else, and they probably get hurt more, but they probably are happier at the end of the day. And so a lot of it is just the mentality of embracing this soft, squishy thing we call love and putting it at the center of life.